the wind a razor clawed across the unforgiving peaks of the San Juan Mountains, driving snow so thick it stole the world. He was a ghost in the blizzard, a man called Jonah, burdened by no name but the one he'd given himself to, seeking nothing but oblivion. Then he saw her, a figure chained to the frozen heart of a dying pine, a whisper away from becoming another lost soul swallowed by the storm. Her survival was impossible, her rescue a death wish. But in the swirling white hell, a flicker of a forgotten past stirred within him, compelling him towards the impossible. The blizzard showed no mercy. It had descended upon the high passes of the San Juan Mountains 3 days prior, a relentless, howling beast of ice and wind, transforming the familiar rugged landscape into an alien terrain of monstrous white drifts and skeletal ice-encased pines. For Jonah, a man who deliberately carried no past and sought no future, the storm was a fitting companion, mirroring the desolation he cultivated within his own soul. He rode his weary Mustang, Ghosthead, bowed against the stinging onslaught, trusting the animal's instinct more than his own frosted eyes. They were headed nowhere in particular, just away. Away from towns, from people, from the echoes of a life he'd buried deep beneath layers of cold indifference. It was Ghost who sensed her first. The Mustang's ears, normally flattened against the gale, pricked forward. It whinnied a low, uneasy sound that was nearly snatched away by the wind and sidestepped, fighting Jonah's numb pull on the reins. Jonah, swathed in layers of worn wool and buffalo hide, his face a mask of ice and stubble, squinted through the maelstrom. Visibility was a cruel joke, barely 10 feet in any direction. He was about to urge Ghost on, dismissing it as a trick of the wind, a coyote perhaps, when a flicker of unnatural darkness against the white registered. He dismounted his legs, stiff, sinking almost to his knees in the fresh powder. Each step was a monumental effort. The wind shrieked, trying to tear the breath from his lungs, pushing him back. He leaned into it, one hand on the Colt Peacemaker, holstered at his hip, a reflex for what threat could be worse than the storm itself. Then he saw it more clearly. Not a shadow, but a shape, a human shape. Tethered to the leeward side of a gnarled, ancient pine, sheltered only slightly from the storm's main fury, was a woman. Chains thick and cruelly black against the snow snaked from the tree trunk around her slender waist, and he saw with a jolt her ankles. Her head, weighed down by a tangle of dark, snow-caked hair, was slumped forward, her body listless. She was small, dressed in clothes ill-suited for such brutal weather. A worn cotton dress now stiff with ice, and a thin shawl that offered no real protection. Jonah's first thought, cold and pragmatic, was that she was already dead. No one could survive this, not chained and exposed. He moved closer, his boots crunching on the impacted snow. He reached out a gloved hand, hesitating before touching her cheek. It was colder than the grave. But then a faint tremor, a shudder that ran through her frail form, almost imperceptible. And beneath the ice clinging to her lashes, her eyelids fluttered. A spark of something he hadn't felt in years, something dangerously close to concern, ignited within him. He knelt, his own discomfort forgotten. "Ma'am." His voice was a harsh rasp, unused to gentle inquiry. Her head lolled slightly. He brushed the frozen hair from her face. Her skin was pale, tinged with blue around the lips. But her eyes, when they finally cracked open, were a startling, vivid green, now clouded with confusion and the dull glaze of encroaching death. They focused on him, or perhaps through him, for a fleeting second. A single hoarse whisper escaped her lips, so faint he almost missed it. "Cold." The chains were thick, the locks sturdy. Whoever had done this meant for her to die. A slow, agonizing freeze, a monument to their malice. Anger and emotion Jonah thought he'd long since mastered flickered hot and sharp through his icy veins. This wasn't the work of the wild. This was the deliberate cruelty of men. "Hold on." He grunted more to himself than to her. He first checked the chains on her ankles. They were secured by a heavy padlock. The one around her waist, binding her to the tree, was similarly fastened. He didn't have a key. He didn't carry tools for thievery. But he carried a gun, and sometimes a bullet was the only key that mattered. The problem was the ricochet and the proximity to her flesh. He looked around. The wind howled its mournful song. There were no other options. She wouldn't last another hour, perhaps not even another 30 minutes. "Cover your face," he ordered, his voice rough but firm. He wasn't sure if she could understand or even comply. He pulled up his own neckerchief, further shielding his nose and mouth. He drew his Colt, the cold steel, a familiar weight in his hand. He took a deep breath, the frigid air burning his lungs. He aimed carefully at the shackle of the padlock on the ankle chain, trying to find an angle that would direct the bullet fragment away from her. The shot was deafening in the muffled world of the snowstorm. The smell of gunpowder briefly cut through the scent of pine and ice. The padlock shattered one half, pinging off into the deep snow. The chain fell loose. She gasped a small, ragged sound. He didn't waste time. He moved to the second lock, the one binding her to the tree. This was trickier, closer to her body. He had to position himself awkwardly, shielding her as much as possible with his own bulk. Another shot, another metallic crack. The chain clattered free. She slumped forward, and he caught her before she could fall face first into the snow. She was lighter than he expected, a bird-like fragility beneath the frozen clothes. Her eyes were closed again. He checked her pulse at her neck. It was there, a faint, thready beat, a stubborn ember refusing to be extinguished. "Not today," he muttered to her, to the storm, to whatever ghosts watched from the swirling white. "You don't die today." He had to get her warm and fast. His small lean-to, hastily constructed the night before, was a good hour's ride back, and Ghost couldn't carry them both quickly through this. He scanned the immediate vicinity. A small rock outcropping, barely visible through the snow, offered a sliver of hope, a potential windbreak. He lifted her, her frozen limbs stiff and unyielding. It was like carrying a statue carved from ice. Ghost, patient as ever, stood his ground, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Jonah draped her over the saddle, then mounted behind her, pulling her back against his chest, trying to share what little warmth his own body still possessed. "Easy, Ghost," he murmured, turning the Mustang towards the faint promise of shelter. The wind tore at them, seeming to redouble its efforts, as if angered by his defiance. The woman in his arms was terrifyingly still. He could feel the cold seeping from her into him. He urged Ghost onward, into the teeth of the white hell, a desperate race against a death that felt as tangible as the falling snow. The rock outcropping was less a cave and more a shallow scoop in the mountainside, barely deep enough to blunt the wind's main force. But it was something. Jonah eased the woman whose name he still didn't know from Ghost's back and laid her gently on his bedroll, which he spread over a patch of snow he'd kicked clear. She remained limp, her breathing shallow. Hypothermia was his enemy now. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency. First, the wet, frozen clothes. His fingers clumsy with cold, despite his gloves fumbled with the stiff fabric of her dress. He had to cut parts of it away with his knife. Beneath it, her skin was alarmingly white, almost translucent. He stripped off his own outer coat, the heavy buffalo hide, and wrapped her in it, then covered her with his remaining blankets. He needed a fire. Gathering wood in this maelstrom was a fool's errand, but he always carried a small bundle of dry kindling and a few larger pieces strapped to his saddle for emergencies. This qualified. With numb fingers, he arranged the wood in the most sheltered nook of the outcropping, using his body to shield the fledgling flames from the swirling snow. Flint and steel sparked caught the tinder, and after what felt like an eternity of coaxing, a small, hungry fire crackled to life. The warmth was meager, but precious. He positioned himself beside the woman, trying to create a barrier against the cold drafts that still managed to curl around the edges of their inadequate shelter. He chafed her hands between his, feeling the iciness of her skin gradually, almost imperceptibly lessen. Her eyelids fluttered again. This time her eyes, though still hazed with pain and exhaustion, held a flicker of awareness. "Water," she rasped, her lips cracked. He had a canteen, the water within it partially frozen. He managed to thaw some by the fire, then carefully tipped a little between her lips. She swallowed with difficulty. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice thin as spun glass. "Name's Jonah," he said, his tone flat. "Who are you? And who decided to leave you as a winter decoration?" A shadow passed over her face. Fear. "Abigail," she breathed. "My name is Abigail, and they'll come back for me." "Who's they?" Jonah pressed, keeping his voice even. He needed information, but he also sensed the terror that gripped her. She shook her head, her eyes darting nervously towards the swirling snow beyond their shelter. "Men. Cruel men. They said I saw too much." "Saw what?" Tears welled in her eyes, freezing on her lashes. "It doesn't matter. They'll find me. They'll find us." Her gaze fixed on him, wid and desperate. "You shouldn't have helped me. They'll kill you too." Jonah grunted, adding a piece of wood to the fire. "Been plenty of folks wanted to do that. Storm might get us both before they do." He looked at her closely. Abigail. She was young, perhaps early 20s, with features that even now, marred by cold and fear, hinted at a delicate beauty. But it was the terror in her eyes that held his attention. It was raw, profound. "What were you doing so high in the passes? This ain't country for a woman alone, especially not dressed like you were." "I wasn't alone," she said, her voice trembling. "I was with my brother. We were heading to Silverton. He has a claim there. Or he was hoping to stake one near the old Sunnyside mine workings. We were ambushed. They shot him." The tears flowed freely now, carving hot tracks down her frozen cheeks. "They took our wagon, our supplies. They dragged me away, said I'd be a message." A message to whom Jonah didn't ask, not yet. Her story, if true, was grim. Bandits were common enough, but this level of calculated cruelty, leaving her to freeze, was something else. He noticed the angry red welts on her wrists and ankles, where the chains had been now beginning to darken into bruises. He had some salve in his saddlebags, a potent concoction of herbs and bear grease he used for wounds and frostbite. He retrieved it, and with a gentleness that surprised even himself, began to apply it to her chafed skin. She flinched at his touch, but didn't pull away. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the wind's mournful cry. Jonah didn't look at her. "Maybe I don't like bullies," he said, his voice gruff. "Or maybe I'm just tired of the quiet." It was as close to an honest answer as he was capable of giving. The truth was, he didn't fully understand it himself. Something about her profound vulnerability, her defiance in the face of certain death, had pierced through his carefully constructed apathy. As the small fire cast flickering shadows on the rock walls and the storm continued its assault, outside a fragile truce settled between them. Abigail, exhausted and weak, drifted into a fitful sleep, occasionally murmuring or crying out softly. Jonah sat watch his back to the rock, his colt resting on his lap. He listened to the wind, and he listened for other sounds, the crunch of boots in the snow, the whinny of horses, the sounds of men who might be looking for a woman they'd left for dead. He didn't doubt they would come. The kind of men who chained a woman to a tree in a blizzard weren't the type to leave loose ends. He was no hero, had no desire to be. But he'd interfered. And in the unforgiving logic of the wilderness that made her fate for now intertwined with his past was a void, but his present had just become dangerously complicated. He felt a grim certainty that the relative peace of this makeshift shelter was temporary. Trouble was coming as surely as the dawn, if they lived to see it. Dawn, when it finally broke, was a mere lightening of the oppressive grey. The snow had lessened to flurries, but the wind still bit with an icy malice, sculpting the drifts into fantastic, treacherous shapes. Abigail was awake, weak but lucid. The colour had returned to her cheeks, though her eyes still held the haunted look of someone who had stared into the abyss. Jonah had managed to make a thin broth from dried jerky and melted snow. It wasn't much, but it was warm. Abigail drank it slowly, her hands trembling as she held the tin cup. "We can't stay here," Jonah said, his gaze sweeping the desolate landscape. "They'll backtrack you once the storm clears enough." "Where can we go?" Abigail asked, her voice fragile. "They have horses' supplies. We have almost nothing." "We have Ghost," Jonah said, nodding towards the Mustang, who was patiently enduring the cold, his shaggy coat dusted with fresh snow. "And we have a head start, however small. They'll assume you're dead. Might make them careless." He didn't voice his other concern that they might not be looking for her, but for him, the interferer. He helped her to her feet. She was unsteady, her legs stiff and sore. He knew they couldn't travel fast. He repacked his meager supplies, his movements economical and precise. He offered Abigail his spare pair of thick woolen socks to pull over her own, and a spare, albeit oversized, flannel shirt to add another layer beneath the buffalo coat. The nearest place with any semblance of law is Durango, but that's a hard ride south days from here. "Especially in this," he said, thinking aloud. "And likely the first place they'd expect someone to run if they were trying to report something." He paused. "Silverton, you said your brother had a claim there." Abigail nodded. "He said it was promising, near the Animus River up high. He had papers, a map." Her eyes filled with fresh grief. "They took everything." "Silverton is closer than Durango, but it's a rough mining town, full of men looking to strike it rich, and not all of them pleasant." He considered. "But it might be our best bet if we can avoid the main trails. If these men are local to that area, though we're walking into the hornet's nest." "I don't know where they're from," Abigail whispered. "They wore scarves over their faces. Their leader, he was tall with eyes like chips of ice. He spoke with a strange accent, not southern, not eastern. Cold, like the mountains." Jonah filed that description away. "We move slow, stay off the ridges, listen more than we look." The going was brutal. The snow lay deep and often hid treacherous ice or loose rock. Jonah led Ghost with Abigail, riding huddled in the heavy coat. He broke trail, his powerful frame pushing through drifts, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, every shadow, every distant sound. The silence when the wind briefly died down was profound, unnerving. It was a silence that felt like it was listening. Hours passed in a grueling, snow-blind march. The landscape was a monochrome canvas of white and grey, broken only by the dark sentinels of pine and the stark, unforgiving rock faces. Jonah pushed them onward, driven by a cold knot of apprehension in his gut. Late afternoon, as the light began to fade into a bruised purple, he called a halt in a dense thicket of young spruce that offered slightly better concealment. He didn't dare risk a fire yet. They ate cold jerky and hardtack, the silence heavy between them. Suddenly, Ghost's head snapped up, ears swiveling a low rumble in his chest. Jonah's hand went to his Colt. He listened, straining to hear past the soughing of the wind in the branches. Then he heard it. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The jingle of harness. Horses. More than one. "Down," he hissed, pushing Abigail gently but firmly lower behind the thickest part of the snow-laden spruce. He drew his Winchester rifle from its scabbard on Ghost's saddle, his movements fluid and practiced. He peered through a small gap in the branches. 3 riders picked their way through the snow about 200 yards distant, following what looked like the faint depression of the trail they themselves had made earlier. They were heavily armed, cloaked against the cold, their faces obscured by shadow and distance. One of them pointed towards the ground, then gestured in their general direction. "They found our tracks," Jonah murmured, his voice grim. "Faster than I hoped." Abigail's breath hitched. "It's them! I know it!" Even from this distance, there was a menace in their posture, a predatory focus. The riders were slow, cautious, clearly experienced trackers. They were closing the distance. Jonah had a decision to make, and fast. They couldn't outrun them in Abigail's condition, not for long, and Ghost was already tired. Hiding might work if the pursuers were careless, but these men didn't seem the type. "Stay here, stay quiet, no matter what," Jonah instructed Abigail, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. He checked the load in his Winchester. He was a good shot, but 3-1 in the open with Abigail to protect were poor odds. He preferred to choose his ground. He scanned the terrain. A narrow defile between 2 rock formations lay a short distance ahead. If he could draw them in there. "When I move, give me a minute, then make your way to those rocks." He pointed. "Stay low. Ghost will follow you if you call him softly." "What are you going to do?" Abigail whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Create a disagreement," Jonah said, a humorless line twisting his lips. He gave her shoulder a quick, reassuring squeeze, an uncharacteristically gentle gesture. Then he slipped away from the spruce trees, moving with a speed and silence that belied his size, circling wide to position himself further up the slope, overlooking the path the riders would have to take. He found his spot behind a jumble of snow-covered boulders, the Winchester resting steady on a flat rock. The wind was at his back, carrying any sound he made away from them. He watched as the 3 riders advanced, now clearly visible. One taller than the others, with a distinctive silver concho on his hatband, seemed to be the leader. Jonah remembered Abigail's description, eyes like chips of ice. He wondered if this was him. They were almost directly below him now, strung out in single file. Jonah took a steadying breath, the cold air sharp in his lungs. He wasn't aiming to kill, not yet. He was aiming to make a statement. He sighted on a snowdrift just in front of the lead rider's horse. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the Winchester echoed through the mountains, startlingly loud. Snow erupted where the bullet hit, and the lead horse reared, screaming in fright, nearly unseating its rider. The other 2 horses shied their riders, cursing, trying to control them while simultaneously reaching for their own weapons. "That's far enough, gentlemen." Jonah's voice boomed down from the rocks, amplified by the terrain. "Lost something, have you?" The three riders scrambled for cover, fanning out their eyes, scanning the rocks above. The leader, his face a mask of fury, shouted, "Who's up there? Show yourself!" "Just a concerned citizen," Jonah called back. "Don't like to see folks tracking a lady with such ill intent." "That woman is a thief and a murderess," the leader roared, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "There's a bounty on her head. Step aside, friend, and you won't get hurt." Jonah felt Abigail, who must have reached the rocks he'd indicated, stiffen behind him. A thief and a murderess. That wasn't the story she'd told, but there was no time to ponder that now. "Bounty, you say?" Jonah called, stalling for time, trying to gauge their positions. "Funny, she didn't strike me as the type. Looks more like the victim to me." One of the other men, impatient, fired a wild shot towards Jonah's position. The bullet whined off a rock uncomfortably close. "Seems you're not interested in talking," Jonah observed dryly. He fired again, this time aiming for the hat of the man who had shot at him. The hat flew off the man's head as if snatched by an invisible hand. The man yelped and ducked lower. "Damn you," the leader snarled. "Get him. He can't be alone." The fight was on. Jonah knew this was just the beginning. He'd bought them a few moments, perhaps an opportunity to make their pursuers more cautious, but he'd also confirmed their suspicions and escalated the conflict. The echoes of the gunshots faded, replaced by the heavy silence of the mountains, pregnant with menace. The white landscape, moments before a symbol of desolation, was now a battlefield. The exchange of gunfire was brief but brutal. Jonah, using the superior cover of the rocks, managed to keep the three pursuers pinned down. He wasn't aiming to kill, but to dissuade and disable. A well-placed shot crippled the front leg of one of their horses, sending it screaming to the ground, and its rider tumbling into a snowdrift. Another bullet tore through the saddlebag of the second man, scattering his supplies. The leader, the one with the silver concho, cursed venomously, but seemed reluctant to expose himself further to Jonah's accurate fire. "This ain't over, damn you," the leader yelled, his voice raw with fury. "You'll pay for this. We know these mountains. You can't hide for a hole forever, under the cover of their disarray." Jonah signaled to Abigail. "Now move west towards that broken ridge." While two of the men were occupied with their downed horse and scattered gear, Jonah laid down, covering fire, forcing the leader to stay low. Abigail, fear etched on her face, but her movements surprisingly quick, scrambled from their shelter, Ghost trotting obediently beside her. Jonah waited until they were a safe distance away, then fired a final shot that kicked up snow near the leader's position before melting back into the rocks himself, retreating in a different direction to mislead any immediate pursuit. He circled around, moving with the wind, using every dip and rise in the terrain, to his advantage, eventually rejoining Abigail and Ghost, as dusk settled into a deep, frigid night. They didn't dare a fire that night. They huddled together for warmth in a shallow ice cave he found carved by meltwater on the side of a ravine, the wind howling a mournful dirge above them. Ghost stood sentinel at the narrow entrance. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions. Finally, Abigail broke it, her voice trembling. They called me a thief, a murderess." Jonah chewed on a piece of jerky, his face unreadable in the gloom. "Were they lying?" Abigail hesitated. Not entirely, but not the way they mean it." She took a shaky breath. "My brother Thomas, he wasn't just a prospector. He was a good man, but he fell in with bad company in Durango, Men led by a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne. Jonah's head came up slightly. The name was unfamiliar, yet it had a certain ring to it, like old money or new power. Yes, Elias Thorne's son. Thorne owns the Redemption Mine near Silverton, or so I've heard people whisper. One of the biggest operations. But his son Marcus, he runs his own crew. They deal in things other than ore. Stolen goods, information. Sometimes they make people disappear. She shivered, pulling the buffalo coat tighter around herself. Thomas got indebted to Marcus. Deeply. Marcus forced him to help with a robbery. A payroll shipment meant for another mine. Thomas didn't want to. He told me. He was terrified, but he saw no way out. He told me he was only supposed to drive a decoy wagon. And what about you? Jonah's voice was quiet, non-judgmental but insistent. I knew Thomas was in trouble. I followed him the night they were supposed to do it. I was hidden. I saw it go wrong. It wasn't a clean robbery. Marcus Thorne shot the guards, in cold blood. One of them was a young deputy, hardly more than a boy. Thomas saw it too. He was horrified. Her voice cracked. Marcus saw me, just a glimpse as I fled. And he knew Thomas wouldn't stay silent, not after witnessing that. So they came after us. We ran, tried to lose them in the mountains. We were going to try and reach the marshal in Ouray, not Silverton. But they caught up. They killed Thomas. And left me. So the thief and murderess accusation is Thorne trying to discredit you if you were ever found alive, Jonah surmised. A convenient lie to cover his own tracks and ensure no one would listen to your story. Abigail nodded miserably. He probably put a bounty out, just like his man said. He has money influence. Who would believe me over him? Jonah was silent for a long moment. The wind whistled outside their icy refuge. Abigail's story had the ring of truth. The kind of messy, desperate truth that often got people killed in these parts. It also put them in even greater danger. Marcus Thorne, if he was anything like the powerful mining barons Jonah had heard tales of, would not give up easily, especially with murder accusations hanging over his head. Thorne's men, the one in charge with the silver concho on his hat. Do you know his name? Jonah asked. I heard Marcus call him Caleb, Abigail whispered. Caleb is ruthless. He's Thorne's right hand. Caleb, another name to remember. Why didn't you tell me all this before? Jonah asked, his voice still even. I was scared, Abigail admitted. Scared you wouldn't help me if you thought I was mixed up in something so bad. Scared you'd turn me in for the bounty imaginary, or not. Jonah considered her words. He understood fear. He'd lived with his own version of it for years, a constant companion. The truth is usually a heavier burden, he said finally, but it's also a clearer path. Now we know what we're truly up against. He thought of his own past, the shadows he ran from. He'd seen the corruption of powerful men, the way they twisted lives and laws to suit their purposes. Abigail's story resonated with a grim familiarity. Silverton is definitely out, he said. If Thorne has interests there, his men will be crawling all over it. Ouray might be an option to find this marshal you spoke of, but it's a hard journey, and Caleb will expect us to head for the nearest sign of law. He looked out at the relentless dance of snowflakes in the darkness. There's an old trapper's route seldom used that cuts across the range towards the Uncompahgre Plateau. It's longer, harder, but it might be our best chance to shake them. Can we make it? Abigail asked, her voice small. Jonah looked at her, really looked at her. She was terrified out of her depth grieving, and yet she was still here, still fighting. A core of steel beneath the fear. "We'll have to," he said. It wasn't a promise of success, but a statement of grim intent. As they lapsed back into a weary silence, Jonah found his thoughts drifting. He had intervened to save a woman from the storm, a simple act or so he'd thought. Now he was embroiled in a feud with a powerful mining family's brutal enforcers, protecting a witness to murder. His attempt to remain detached, a ghost in the wilderness, was failing spectacularly. The threads of Abigail's desperate story were beginning to weave themselves into the barren tapestry of his own existence, pulling him towards a confrontation he hadn't sought, but now seemed unable to avoid. The path ahead was indeed dangerous, not just from the elements and their pursuers, but from the reawakening of purpose within himself, a feeling he had tried for so long to kill. The old trapper's route was more myth than trail, a barely discernible path that snaked through treacherous high country, avoiding the more frequented passes. For 3 days they pushed westward, the San Juan peaks slowly giving way to the vast, broken country leading towards the Uncompahgre Plateau. The going was brutal. Snow still lay thick in the shaded valleys and high meadows, and the wind was a constant biting companion. Abigail, though still weak, showed a resilience that surprised Jonah. She rarely complained, her small face set with a grim determination that mirrored his own. They saw no sign of Caleb or his men, but Jonah didn't allow himself to relax. Men like Caleb were patient hunters. He felt their phantom presence in the howling of the wind, in the snap of a twig, in the frozen silence. On the 4th day, as the snow thinned and the landscape grew marginally less hostile, they stumbled upon it, a ghost town, huddled in a narrow, forgotten valley. Not the grand, decaying remnants of a famous boom town, but a smaller, sadder affair. A dozen or so cabins, their roofs caved in their windows, like hollow eyes, a single dilapidated saloon, with its sign, "The Gilded Cage," hanging askew. It was a place where dreams had clearly come to die. "We can rest here for a day," Jonah decided, his voice raspy from the cold and disuse. "Find better shelter, maybe even risk a proper fire if one of these shacks is sound enough." Ghost was exhausted, and even Jonah felt the relentless strain of their journey. They chose the least decrepit cabin, one whose roof was mostly intact, and whose door, though hanging by a single leather hinge, could be propped shut. Inside it was dusty and filled with the scent of decay, but it offered a reprieve from the wind. Jonah managed to patch a hole in the stone chimney, and soon a small, cautious fire was burning in the hearth, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The warmth was a blessed relief. Abigail sagged against the wall, the tension visibly draining from her. Jonah took the first watch, sitting by the single grime-covered window, his Winchester across his knees, while Abigail finally succumbed to a deep, exhausted sleep. He watched the snow fall lightly outside the flakes, swirling around the skeletal remains of the town. This place he thought was a monument to failed hopes, much like his own life had been, before he'd shed his past. What had happened here? A vein of gold that petered out, a harsh winter that drove everyone away. Or something darker. Jonah's face was a granite mask. The past, it seemed, had a way of digging its claws into you, no matter how far you ran or how deep you tried to bury it. The ghost town aptly named was about to witness a reunion of ghosts. And Josiah Pike was not known for friendly visits. The twist of fate was cruel. In seeking to escape one enemy, he had stumbled directly into the path of another far more personal threat. The name Pike had uttered, the one Jonah had shed like a snakeskin years ago, hung heavy in the frigid air of the cabin. Sergeant Caleb Cal Jackson, Confederate States Army, a name synonymous with grit survival, and a darkness Jonah had fought to leave behind in the blood-soaked fields of the war, and the desperate, lawless years that followed. Abigail looked from Jonah's stony face to the door, her eyes wide, with a new kind of fear. "What does he mean, old name?" "It means trouble," Jonah said curtly. He raised his voice. "Pike, what do you want?" "Just a conversation." "Cal," Pike's voice came back, still unnervingly amiable. "Been looking for you for a good while. Imagine my surprise finding you shacked up in this ruin. You always did have a taste for desolate places." A dry chuckle followed. "Come on out, or do I come in? That door doesn't look too sturdy." Jonah weighed his options. Pike was alone as far as he could tell, but Pike alone was dangerous enough. He was a renowned tracker, but also a deadly shot and patient as a spider. A firefight in this flimsy cabin would put Abigail directly in harm's way. "Stay back from the door," Jonah told Abigail, pushing her towards the rear of the cabin. "And keep this." He pressed his spare Colt into her hand. She looked at it, then at him. Her fear mingled with a dawning understanding of the depth of the danger they were in. "I know how to use it," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Jonah nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. He took a deep breath. "All right, Pike. I'm coming out. Alone. No sudden moves." "Wouldn't dream of it, Cal." Jonah holstered his own Colt, but his hand hovered near it. He unbarred the makeshift door and stepped out into the pale moonlit snow. Josiah Pike stood about 20 feet away, near the corner of the dilapidated saloon, the gilded cage. He was leaner than Jonah remembered, his face weathered and scarred, but his eyes, even in the dim light, were as sharp and predatory as ever. He held a Spencer rifle casually in the crook of his arm. "You've led me a merry chase, Cal," Pike said, his lips twisting into a semblance of a smile. "Last I heard, you'd vanished up in the territories. Figured you were dead or had joined the spirits of the mountains." "I prefer solitude," Jonah said, his voice flat. "What do you want, Pike, if it's about the old days they're gone? Buried." Pike's smile faded. "Some things don't stay buried, Cal. Some debts don't get erased by time or distance." He gestured with his rifle towards the cabin. "Who's the girl? Looks like you found yourself a reason to stop running from everything but your own shadow." "She's got nothing to do with you or me," Jonah said, his stance unwavering. "Maybe," Pike conceded. "Maybe not. Funny thing is, I wasn't looking for her. I was tracking a different kind of scum. A bastard named Caleb works for some mining tyrant called Thorn. Word is they left a woman for dead up in the San Juans after killing her brother. Some folks in Ouray, friends of the dead deputy your girl mentioned, put up a quiet reward for information leading to Thorn's enforcers. Figured you might have crossed paths with them, given your current predicament." Jonah was stunned. Pike wasn't with Thorn. He was hunting Thorn's men. This was a twist he hadn't anticipated. The enemy of his enemy. But Pike was no friend. "So you're a bounty hunter now?" Jonah asked, suspicion lacing his tone. "Let's just say I collect on overdue accounts," Pike said, his eyes glinting. "And speaking of accounts, there's still the matter of what happened outside El Paso. The gold shipment we were supposed to guard." Jonah's jaw tightened. El Paso. Another ghost he couldn't shake. After the war, options had been scarce. He and Pike, along with a few other desperate ex-soldiers, had taken a job guarding a shipment for a wealthy landowner. The shipment had vanished along with 2 of their own men. Pike had always suspected Jonah knew more than he'd let on, that he'd somehow profited from the chaos. Jonah had walked away from it all, seeking to disappear, leaving a cloud of unanswered questions and Pike's simmering resentment behind. "I told you then. I don't know what happened to that gold," Jonah said, his voice low and hard. "And I didn't kill Cooper or Davis." "Convenient," Pike sneered. "You just vanished. Left me to answer the questions. Left me with nothing. This isn't the time or place, Pike." "Oh, I think it's the perfect time." Pike countered, his grip tightening on the Spencer. "Moonlight ghost town, just you and me. And your lady friend who seems to be in a whole heap of trouble herself. Trouble I might be able to help with. For a price." "What price?" Jonah asked, wary. "The truth about El Paso," Pike said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And maybe a share of what you squirreled away. Then perhaps I help you deal with this Thorn business. 2 birds, 1 stone. Or you can try your luck against me now and then face Thorn's men alone. If you survive me, that is." Before Jonah could answer, a new sound cut through the tense silence. The unmistakable jingle of harness and the crunch of multiple horses moving through the snow. Not from the direction Pike had come, but from the main trail leading into the valley. Pike cursed under his breath. "Company, and not the friendly kind, I'd wager." Jonah's eyes narrowed. He recognized the pattern of movement, the number of riders. "Caleb," he said grimly. "He must have picked up our trail where it crossed the easier path into this valley." Pike glanced at Jonah, a new calculation in his eyes. "Well, Cal, looks like fate decided to force our hand. Seems we have a common enemy, at least for tonight." Suddenly the front window of the cabin behind Jonah exploded inwards as a bullet smashed through it. Abigail screamed. "Abigail!" Jonah yelled, spinning around, instinct taking over. "Down, you fool!" Pike tackled Jonah, driving him into the snow as a volley of shots ripped through the air where he'd been standing. The Gilded Cage Saloon sign splintered, and bullets thudded into the log walls of the cabin. Caleb and his men, at least 4 of them, had arrived, and they weren't waiting for introductions. They'd seen Pike and Jonah seen the cabin and opened fire. Pike rolled away, coming up in a crouch, his Spencer already barking back, spitting fire towards the ambushers who were using the dilapidated buildings across the small, snow-filled square as cover. "Looks like Thorn's welcoming committee is a little eager." Jonah scrambled back towards the cabin, bullets kicking up snow around his feet. "Abigail, are you hit?" "No, I'm okay." Her voice came from inside, shaky but clear. "They're shooting from everywhere." Jonah reached the dubious cover of the cabin wall. He was caught between 2 fires, Pike, whose intentions were still dangerously ambiguous, and Caleb's murderous crew. But right now, Caleb was the immediate, overwhelming threat. "Pike!" Jonah yelled over the gunfire. "Truce until we deal with these bastards!" Pike, reloading his Spencer behind the overturned wreck of an old wagon, gave a short, harsh laugh. "Only 'cause they shot at me first. Cal don't get any ideas." The ghost town had become a shooting gallery. Muzzle flashes lit up the decaying facades of the buildings. The night air, moments before, still and frigid, now reeked of gunpowder and sudden death. Jonah knew this was it, the reckoning. Not just with Caleb and Thorn's men, but potentially with the ghosts of his own past, embodied by the deadly man now fighting for the moment by his side. Survival tonight would require more than just skill with a gun. It would require trusting a man he had every reason to despise and confronting dangers that came from both without and within. The gilded cage was about to live up to its name, trapping them all in a desperate fight for their lives. The firefight in the ghost town was chaotic and brutal. Caleb's men, initially confident in their numbers, quickly discovered they were facing more than just one desperate man and a frightened woman. Pike, despite his cynical pronouncements, fought with a lethal efficiency, his Spencer finding its mark with grim regularity. Jonah positioned to defend the cabin, and Abigail used his Winchester to pick off targets of opportunity, each shot precise, aimed to incapacitate rather than kill outright if possible, a habit from a lifetime trying to minimize rather than maximize bloodshed, unless absolutely necessary. Abigail, to Jonah's surprise and immense relief, proved to be more than a helpless victim. From a shattered window, she fired the Colt Jonah had given her not wildly, but with a surprising calmness, forcing one of Caleb's men to abandon a flanking maneuver. Her shots were more to deter than to hit, but they served their purpose, making the attackers wary of exposing themselves. There's too many of them to hold this spot for long. "Cal!" Pike yelled, ducking as bullets chewed the wood of the wagon he used for cover. "That Thorn fellow sent his whole damn army." "Just need to thin them out," Jonah called back, firing at a muzzle flash from the shadowy doorway of the old assay office. A grunt of pain answered his shot. "Caleb!" "You hear me?" Jonah bellowed, his voice carrying over the din. "This fight is with me. Let the woman go. She's no threat to your boss anymore." Caleb's voice, laced with venom, answered from the darkness. "She's a witness, Jackson, or whatever your name is. Thorn pays well for silence, and he pays even better for those who interfere." Another volley of shots underscored his words, peppering the front of the cabin. Jonah knew Caleb wouldn't back down. Men like him, loyal to masters like Thorn, only understood violence and domination. One of Caleb's men, emboldened or foolish, made a rush towards the side of the cabin, hoping to get a clear shot through a breach in the wall. Pike's Spencer roared, and the man crumpled, clutching his leg. His cry cut short. "That's 3 down by my count." Pike shouted, a hint of grim satisfaction in his tone. "They're not as tough as they thought." But Caleb was wily. Under the cover of suppressive fire, he and his remaining man, only one now Jonah realized, began to maneuver using the dilapidated buildings as a maze. The firing became sporadic, more cautious. They were being hunted and were hunting in the moonlit ruins. "They're trying to circle us," Jonah muttered, his eyes scanning the shifting shadows. "Pike, watch your left flank. They'll try to get behind the saloon." As if on cue, a figure darted from behind the gilded cage, heading towards Pike's exposed side. "Pike, behind you!" Abigail screamed from the cabin. Pike spun, bringing his Spencer up, but the attacker was fast. Jonah didn't hesitate. He raised his Winchester, took a snapshot. The bullet caught the running man in the shoulder, spinning him around his own shot, going wide into the night sky. The man fell groaning. That left only Caleb. Silence descended heavy and expectant. The only sounds were the sighing of the wind through the ruined buildings and the pained moans of the wounded gunman. "Caleb!" Jonah called out again. "It's over. Your men are down. Give it up." No answer. Just the oppressive silence. "He's a snake," Pike said, his voice low. "He'll be looking for one last bite." Jonah knew Pike was right. Caleb wouldn't surrender. He would either try to escape or make one final desperate play. Suddenly, Ghost, who had been surprisingly calm inside the cabin, let out a sharp, warning snort, his ears pinned towards the rear of the structure. The back, Jonah realized. Caleb had circled all the way around, using the darkness and the jumble of outbuildings for cover, trying to get into the cabin from its weakest point. He raced back inside. Abigail was already there, her Colt aimed at the flimsy back door, which was splintering around its frame as someone outside kicked at it. "Get down!" Jonah shoved her aside just as the door burst inwards, and Caleb stood framed in the opening, his face contorted in a snarl, his pistol leveled. Time seemed to slow. Jonah saw the flash from Caleb's muzzle, felt the searing heat as a bullet tore through the fleshy part of his left arm. He ignored the pain, bringing his own Colt up, firing twice. Caleb staggered, his eyes wide with shock, his pistol clattering to the floor. He clutched his chest, a dark stain blooming on his shirt. He took one more stumbling step into the cabin, then collapsed, his eyes staring sightlessly at the dirt floor. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Jonah's ragged breathing and the distant, mournful howl of a coyote. It was over. Abigail rushed to Jonah's side, her face pale. "You're hit. It's nothing," Jonah grunted, though the pain was now making itself known, a throbbing fire in his arm. He looked at the body of Caleb, then around the small, smoke-filled cabin. The fight had been short but savage. Pike appeared in the doorway, his Spencer still ready, his eyes taking in the scene. He nodded slowly. "So that's Thorne's top dog. Looks like his bite wasn't as bad as his bark after all." He looked at Jonah's bleeding arm. "You'll live." Jonah tore a strip of cloth from his shirt and began to bind the wound, his movements clumsy with one hand. Abigail helped her touch, surprisingly gentle, but firm. "What now, Pike?" Jonah asked, his gaze steady on the other man. The immediate threat was gone, but the unresolved tension between them remained. Pike leaned against the doorframe, the weariness of the fight, and his long search evident on his face. Now I collect my bounty on these bastards, or what's left of them. Then I take their story and yours, Miss Abigail, to that marshal in Ouray. Thorne won't be able to buy his way out of this one, not with bodies and a credible witness." He looked at Jonah. "And you, Cal? What about El Paso?" Jonah finished tying off the bandage. He met Pike's gaze. "There was no gold left, Pike. Not after the ambush. Cooper and Davis. They turned on us, tried to take what little there was during the fight. It was them or me. I buried them myself. I walked away with nothing but my life and theirs on my conscience. That's the truth. Believe it or not." Pike stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a slow nod. "After all these years, and watching you tonight, I reckon I do, Cal. I reckon I finally do." He sighed, a sound like air escaping a punctured bellows. "Maybe some ghosts are better left buried." He pushed himself off the door frame. "I'll take care of this mess. You two should get moving before proper daylight. Head south from here, then cut east towards the Animus Valley. You can lose yourselves there for a while if you need to. Or if the lady's feeling brave, come with me to Ouray. Your testimony will nail Thorne to the wall." Abigail looked at Jonah, then squared her shoulders. "I'll go to Ouray. Thomas deserves justice. That deputy deserves justice." Jonah looked at her, a rare hint of warmth in his eyes. She'd come a long way from the terrified woman chained to a tree. "Then I'll see you get there," he said simply. Pike smirked. "Looks like you found something to stick around for, after all, Cal. Or should I say Jonah?" Jonah didn't answer, just looked out at the first pale light of dawn, beginning to touch the snow-covered peaks. The ghost town was silent once more, littered with the debris of their desperate battle. He was wounded tired, and his past had not only caught up with him, but fought alongside him. Yet for the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to run. He had a path, a purpose however temporary, and a companion who had faced death with him and emerged stronger. The future was still uncertain, a vast, untamed wilderness, but it no longer felt quite so empty, quite so cold. The storm had passed both outside and perhaps within. And so Jonah the cowboy, who tried to bury his past, and Abigail the woman who refused to be silenced, rode out from the ghost town, leaving behind the echoes of gunfire and the specters of old betrayals. Their journey was far from over the path to justice, fraught with peril. But they faced it together, two souls forged in the crucible of a snowstorm and a desperate fight for survival. What do you think awaits them in Ure? Will Marcus Thorn answer for his crimes, and can Jonah ever truly outrun the shadows of Sergeant Cal Jackson? If you were captivated by their struggle for survival in the unforgiving West, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this story with fellow Western enthusiasts, and subscribe for more tales of grit, danger, and redemption from the wild frontier. Let us know in the comments what you think will happen next. Until then, keep your powder dry.